The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Brandon Rees of the AFL CIO reports that executive earnings are now 61 times that of the average employee, and we all pay. Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis reports from the front lines of a new movement to fight poverty and redefine our moral agenda. And Bill Press talks with author Stu Eizenstat about his new book, President Carter, The White House Years. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Brandon Rees tracks executive pay for the AFL CIO and says the gap between CEO and worker pay is growing at unprecedented levels and driving inequality in America. And we say hello to Brandon Rees, Deputy Director of the Office of Investment for the AFL CIO. Brandon, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. The AFL CIO maintains a website called Executive Pay Watch and issues a report every year. What's the purpose of the project?
So the AFL CIO's Executive Pay Watch website, which is available at paywatch.org, shines a light on runaway CEO pay to better inform the public, shareholders, and workers about how CEO pay has been spiraling out of control over the past several decades and what we can do about it. We've been publishing the website since 1997. S&P 500 companies received, CEOs of S&P 500 companies received nearly $14 million in total compensation last year, which is an astounding 361 times the average production worker's pay in the United States. That ratio of CEO to worker pay far outstrips historical standards. If you go back to the 1980s, the CEOs of large cap companies received only about 42 times median worker pay in the U.S. economy.
Just amazing. This year's report just came out. What are some notable findings this year and changes since last year?
Well, one of the notable changes is that companies are now required to disclose their company-specific pay ratio, how much their CEO makes to their median employee of the company. And so with that data, we now know the level of pay disparity within the organization. Is all the compensation, the lion's share being awarded to the CEO at the very top of the company, or is there a more egalitarian approach to employee compensation that encourages teamwork and collaboration? It's our view that high CEO pay has a negative impact on employee morale and productivity, and that ultimately hurts organizational performance. And so it's important for investors to be aware of this information because workers have always been comparing their pay to their CEO's pay. And it sends a dispiriting message when the CEO's pay is ever on the rise at the same time that workers are being asked to do more with less.
Mm-hmm. And, this year's report highlighted one company, Mondelez International. What should we know about this company?
So Mondelez International is an interesting case because, and I attended the shareholder meeting a couple of weeks ago, the shareholders rejected the CEO's pay package in the Say on Pay advisory vote, largely because of the excessive level of compensation that was awarded to the new CEO, Dick Van de Putte. He received over $42 million in total compensation in 2017. That's an astounding 989 times the company's median employee pay. He also received that pay as part of a Golden Hello package. He only joined the company in November of last year, so that's quite a bit of pay for just a couple of months' work. The previous CEO, Irene Rosenfeld at Mondelez, she received $17 million in total compensation. which was over 403 times median worker pay. This is a company that has been taking away the retirement security of its employees. They just moved to strip the company's defined benefit pension plan from its employees, and has also been criticized by employees for offshoring of jobs, in that they moved several hundred jobs from Chicago to Mexico several years ago. So we think it's an example of why pay ratios matter. It's an indication of reasonableness for CEO pay, and in this case, shareholders voted against the CEO's compensation package, in part because of its excessive size.
We're speaking with Brandon Rees, who's the Deputy Director of the Office of Investment for the AFL CIO, and talking about the Executive Pay Watch. And, Brandon, even with those numbers, Mondelez doesn't have the highest pay ratio. Talk a little bit about Mattel.
Well, so one of the reasons why pay ratio disclosure is so important is that it shines a light on the company's approach to its human capital management. What kinds of employees does it hire? Companies are very fond of saying that their employees are their greatest asset, right? But investors, the public, employees, and potential future employees are given very little information about how that company compensates its workforce. So Mattel is one of the is in fact the highest ratio of CEO to employee pay for S&P 500 companies. Its median employee of the organization is a factory worker in Southeast Asia, makes less than $10,000 a year. Now, what's interesting about this is it tells us the company's approach to production, right? So if you compare Mattel to Hasbro, both of them are toy companies. Mattel has offshored production to other countries where workers pay less. In contrast, Hasbro has higher levels of median worker pay, but that reflects the company's decision to outsource production. So they don't it's not integrated into the company's workforce. It's externalized through a supply chain. And so we believe this information helps shine a light on the company's human capital management practices, allows directors to better understand how the company compensates its workforce, and allows investors to see if their companies are creating good, high-paid jobs.
Now, what's the impact of these kind of pay disparities, not just on workers, but the overall economy?
Well, the runaway CEO pay is really at the heart of growing economic inequality. If you look at who is the top 1%, well, it's corporate CEOs by and large, and so that's largely a policy decision, right? In terms of what level of inequality is ideal or acceptable for our society. There's an interesting academic study by psychologists. It was done in 2014. It asked Americans, well, what do you think? How much do you think CEOs make relative to median employees? And what do you think the ideal ratio is? Well, the survey respondents said that on average that they believed that the ratio of CEO to worker pay was 30-1, and that they thought the ideal ratio would be 7-1. Well, that of course is far below the reality of S&P 500 companies making 361 times the average production worker in our economy, and really shows just how out of line CEO pay levels are with societal expectations.
It's astounding to look at this report and see these numbers. I mean, 5,000 to 1, 4,000 to 1, and that kind of thing. And to see that we're all kind of in the dark about all of this, even though the information's out there. So if people want to go and find out, paywatch.org. It's I don't know. It's disturbing to me a great deal. The report gets a lot of press coverage. Is this an issue average Americans even care about?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've been publishing our Executive Pay Watch website for 20 years now. It's the most popular part of the AFL CIO's website. Working people have been going on to our website to compare their pay to their CEOs. since we created it. And now we have the benefit of knowing just how much companies are paying their employees with the disclosure of median employee pay. So for every publicly traded company in the Russell 3000, we now have not just their CEO's pay, but their median employee pay and the ratio between it. And that ratio is important because it's a measure of reasonableness. It's a measure of what's appropriate, and it really acts as a countervailing metric to the prevailing wisdom of how boards of directors pay their CEOs. And what they do is they compare CEOs to other publicly traded company CEOs. And the problem with that methodology is that it leads to a ratcheting up effect, a Lake Wobegon effect, where all CEOs are above average. Because some companies say, well, we've got an above average CEO, we'll pay him or her above average to reflect that. I've yet to see the company that admitted to paying their CEO below average. Other companies will cherry pick a larger, more successful peer group. Larger companies have higher levels of CEO pay. Mathematically, the pay levels have to rise. So what we're saying is that boards of directors, shareholders, companies, they should be considering what's the best level of pay for our CEO given our own company's philosophy. Are we an egalitarian company that promotes teamwork and collaboration where CEO pay is reasonable compared to other employees? Or is it a winner-take-all system in which the CEO is reaping the lion's share of pay and all the negative consequences that has for employee morale and productivity?
Gosh, how much better off would we be if it really were 30-1 versus some of these astounding numbers that are on this list? We're speaking with Brandon Rees, Deputy Director of the Office of Investment for the AFL CIO. Brandon, how can this report be an effective tool leading up to the midterm elections? For instance, are there specific policies that voters can support that would rein this in?
So, we are going to be using CEO pay as part of our economic narrative to help voters understand what is happening in the economy and how that's largely been derived from economic policies. It's not like the weather. It's not something that just happens because of inequality. It's a conscious choice that policymakers have had, and that's precisely been most recently demonstrated by the decision to cut taxes on corporations. So we've dramatically reduced taxation for companies. And what are companies doing with that bonanza? The windfall from repatriating profits from overseas, well, they're turning around and they're spending it on stock buybacks. So they're buying back their own shares of stock rather than investing in the company to grow the company's operations and to create new jobs. And why would they do that? Why would they buy back shares? Well, it's a short-term approach that may bolster the stock price over the short term, but it absolutely helps CEOs meet their performance benchmarks. Earnings per share is the most frequently used metric for deciding CEO pay levels and their performance. And by buying back shares rather than growing earnings, they can artificially increase that without actually having to do any work. I mean, you're simply writing a check from the company's treasury to purchase shares in the open market. You don't need a well-paid CEO to make that decision.
Yeah, right. Now, the report relies heavily on information mandated by the Dodd-Frank law, which requires disclosure of compensation for publicly traded companies. Many companies oppose this mandate. Not a shocker there, I guess. Is there concern that it could be reversed?
Well, it's been a long fight. People may not remember that the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act was passed in 2010. It's now 2018, and we're finally just getting this information. And every twist and turn during the regulatory process, companies complained, we just don't know how much we pay our employees. Investors won't understand this information. The sky will fall. Well, I think it's important to remember how many companies have gone out of business, how many companies have gone private or not listed their shares on public exchanges because of pay ratio disclosure. So I'll just give you that list right now. Okay, that's the list.
Yeah.
None of them. And so the Chicken Littles from the corporate community and the human resources professionals who decried pay ratio disclosure really been proven wrong. That this is a wealth of information for investors, employees, and the public to better understand CEO pay trends. And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I would be loath to be the politician that would try to repeal this transparency effort because no one in the American public is standing for higher CEO pay at this time.
No, I can't imagine they would be, and especially if they take a look at that list. So how can our listeners find out more about this issue?
Well, I would encourage people to visit paywatch.org. That's www.paywatch.org, and it will direct you to the AFL CIO site. You can see how much your CEO makes and how much that compares to the median employee of the company, and be active in the political process. I believe this information, illustrates why workers need a voice on the job and need to be able to negotiate together for a fair return on our work. And so I think that workers should exercise their freedom to join together in a union in their workplace, to have a voice in the pay of each other, and as well as how CEO pay levels are appropriate. What's the appropriate amount of pay relative to the rest of the workforce?
Yeah, and that's fine. If the CEO makes more money, that's great, but that disparity is just outlandish. Brandon Rees, Deputy Director of the Office of Investment for the AFL CIO, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Brandon, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it and look forward to having you back again soon.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how a new poor people's movement plans to change the way we define morality. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you inject a stream of raw ignorance into a vat of gaseous arrogance, then jolt the mixture with 1,000 megawatts of malevolence, what does it produce? Answer: Donald Trump's executive order of April 12th. King Donald I has been in a deep pout over negative articles about him in the Washington Post newspaper, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, king of the Amazon.com empire. King Trump fired off several rounds of angry tweets assailing King Bezos, including a potshot claiming that Amazon is, quote, ripping off the post office by underpaying for the millions of its packages the Postal Service ships. Tweets aside, Trump has the firepower of the federal government at his fingertips, so he's now arrogantly using the government to escalate his personal spat with Bezos. By executive order, he set up a federal task force to conduct a pernicious political inquisition into, quote, our money-losing post office, particularly looking at the, quote, pricing of the package delivery market. This reflects Trump's vast ignorance. Far from being a money loser, the U.S. Postal Service has actually been earning about $1 billion a year in profit. His false claim of unsustainable postal losses stems from a 2006 political ploy by right-wingers who want to destroy the public service. They passed a law dictating that USPS pre-fund retiree health benefits 75 years into the future, covering benefit costs for workers who haven't even been born, much less hired and retired. This adds a totally hokey expense of up to $5 billion a year to the USPS corporate ledger, creating the fake loss Trump is now so bombastically citing as the rationale for his destructive inquisition. This is Jim Hightower saying, sometimes public policy inadvertently turns bad, but when it's based on ignorance and arrogance, policy inevitably goes bad.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis has spent decades fighting poverty. In a new movement inspired by the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., she says poor people are rising up and demanding justice. And we say hello to Liz Theoharis, co-chair with William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Liz is also the co-director of the Cairo Center and a founder and the coordinator of the Poverty Initiative. Liz Theoharis, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And it's great to have you with us. So let's start with the basics. For anyone that doesn't know this already, what is the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival?
The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is an effort happening across the country in about 40 states and in Washington, D.C., to organize and unite poor people and moral leaders and to shift what this country talks about and what this country acts on, to focus on systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and this distorted moral narrative that blames poor people for our poverty, that pits us against each other, and that claims that there isn't enough to go around when we're really living in a country of abundance.
Now, leading up to the launch of the campaign, you, along with Reverend Barber and others, conducted a listening tour. What did you hear?
We traveled all around the country. We were in poor communities like El Paso, Texas, where there's, families being separated, destroyed, really, by poverty, by unjust immigration policies, by an immoral wall that has been established that hurts all people's lives on both sides of that border. We've been in Lowndes County, Alabama, where families are living with raw sewage coming out of their trailers, where there's inadequate housing, where there's very low-paying jobs. We've been in Grays Harbor, Washington, where homeless millennials live in encampments, where 1,000 out of 16,000 residents are living in homeless encampments, and these are mostly poor white young people who can't find jobs in a failing lumber industry, and so we've seen both deep poverty, deep suffering, but also a power that's coming together where poor people are coming and rising up and saying we can do better than this, that our lives are worth something. And everybody has the right to live. And so people are saying we need to come together across all the lines that divide us. We need to organize in our communities. We need to raise up the contradictions. And we need to demand that we need universal single-payer health care, that we need living wage jobs. We need, housing that's decent and affordable for everyone. We need to curb climate change, we need voter rights. I mean, the fact that we have fewer voting rights 50 years after our ancestors died fighting for voting rights today, we need to do better, and we can.
The tour led to an audit of America, which shows that Americans are in many ways worse off than they were in 1968 when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders launched the Poor People's Campaign. How so?
So it's really amazing. So in the Souls of Poor Folk audit that the Institute for Policy Studies did for us with help from the Urban Institute and with economists and impacted folks and policymakers, I mean, what they found was that there are 60% more poor people today, 50 years later, that we have, as I was just saying, fewer voting rights than we did 50 years ago. That, what climate change and what ecological devastation has done, where we now have 13 million people that can't afford water in this country, where we have 4 million households that have poisoned water with lead coming from their pipes. I mean, that we're living in a time of like great abundance, but the majority of people are hurting. I mean, to have 140 million people who are poor and low income in this country, to have 250,000 people die every year because of poverty. I mean, that's more deaths than cancer and heart disease and strokes combined. And so we are not doing well. But the hope is that people from communities across this country are rising up and doing something about it, and inspired by those that have come before us in history, and saying, we can build a Poor People's Campaign, and we can, really organize, and change the direction that things are going in.
And some of those numbers that you bring up, I mean, it's beyond sobering. Sobering's not even the right word for it. It's especially when we're talking about being the wealthiest country in the world. We're speaking with Liz Theoharis, co-chair with William Barber, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. She's also co-director of the Kairos Center and a founder of the coordinator of the Poverty Initiative. Liz, the use of the word moral in your campaign is important. What kind of morality is called for to fight poverty in America?
Well, for too long, a small group of Christian and religious nationalists has been able to keep a conversation around morality to be confined to issues of abortion, of the idea that Jesus was a card-carrying member of the NRA, to personal property. When 2,000 scriptures in our Bible talk about caring for the least of these, making sure that all have their needs met, making sure that women and children are safe and secure, and making sure that we're caring for our neighbors and for immigrants and for widows. And so, to us, the moral issues of our day and what's at the heart and center of sacred traditions and of our Constitution are issues like healthcare and living wages and education and voting rights and, water rights and, an end to a kind of war economy where 53 cents of every U.S. discretionary dollar goes to the military when only 15 cents goes to anti-poverty programs. And so that is immoral in itself. And so we need to claim, the constitutional and sacred text and people that are not of faith, but who see that the arc of the universe, bends towards justice, and that the issues that our society should be concerned about are, does everyone have enough to eat? And are our kids going to diverse, beautiful schools? I mean, these kinds of issues that are, what are the things that are at the center of our democracy and of our families and of our life, but somehow are not being lifted up by many of our religious leaders.
So, Liz, tell us more about some of the issues you're taking on and the concrete changes you hope to see.
So what we've found in the 40 states that are organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, are grassroots leaders who are taking up the issue of affordable housing, in a place like Washington State or in California, where there's been an outgrowth of homelessness and homeless encampments. So, poor people, homeless people have been organizing and banding together with faith leaders and advocates and activists and saying, we need a good housing policy that makes sure that everybody has somewhere to live, and it's not in a shelter, and it's not, in a community that they're going to have to move from in a year when it gentrifies. There's leaders, out of the Gulf Coast who have been talking about, the ending the leases of the lands that now are going to the oil and gas industry, and in fact, really putting real limits on fracking and on mountaintop removal and on these different ecological issues that are issues about life and livelihood for people, where you can have like 1,200 coal ash sites across this country. That's got to change. Kids are being poised by that, and so then you have a strong organizing amongst low-wage workers. I mean, there are 62 million people in this country who live who are working jobs that are less than a living wage, that pay less than a living wage, and so, we're calling for $15 an hour and the right to organize and form and join unions, and then some, and then to keep on building from there to win wages that would make it possible for people across this country to be able to afford a decent living. I mean, one of the studies that we found in the audit shows that in no city, no town across this United States could someone working for the federal minimum wage afford a 2-bedroom apartment if they were working full-time on the federal minimum wage. I mean, that's insane. I mean, that talks about housing changes that are important and necessary. That talks about wages changes. People are having to work 2-3 low-wage jobs just to be able to pay, their light bill and their heat bill. The lie that poor people, don't work. I mean, poor people are working very hard, very many hours, and are still not able to, keep a roof over our heads, still not able to pay all of our bills. And so the set of demands that we have for the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival, and that those demands are listed on our website, and they're pretty comprehensive, and they're pretty diverse, and go across lots of issues. And some people have said to us, well, that's you're asking for a lot, and our response is that in poor people, all of these issues come together. I mean, folks are having trouble around healthcare. Folks are having trouble around voting rights. I mean, to see the connection between the 23 states that have passed voter suppression laws since 2010, those are the same states that have the lowest wages. Those are the same states that have the highest child poverty and women in poverty. Those are the same states that have the least environmental protections. And so voting rights is a central piece. And in fact, we want to expand voting rights. We think that there should be, and we're calling for, automatic registration at the age of 18. If people can be automatically registered for the military, shouldn't people be also automatically registered to vote and exercise their right to make the decision, make decisions about this country and about their lives? And so we've, coming out of these communities, we've, been talking to folks and hearing what are some of the needs and some of the demands and some of the programs and policies people have been working about in their community, and how do we, bring those to a federal level, to a state level, and make sure that people's lives are put first, and that we have a shift in how things are from how they are today.
And who are some of the organizations involved in the campaign and the actions being taken there?
So this has been something very important about the campaign. As we were launching this campaign, what we did was we traveled around the country and we met up with grassroots efforts of poor people, of clergy, of activists, all across various issues. And folks then came together and formed state coordinating committees in their states. And those state coordinating committees were headed up by, folks that are experiencing these injustices. They were headed up by clergy and others who are standing with poor people and not for poor people and only on behalf of poor people. And they're geographically and racially and religiously diverse. And it was only after these 40 states established these state coordinating committees of these grassroots leaders, of just the people who see, that across states we need to organize. Then various religious denominations, various national organizations came forward and said, well, we too want to organize and be a part of this campaign. And so at this point, 7 or 9 of the major religious denominations have come on board. And what it means for them to come on board isn't just that they're willing to pat us on the back and say, go do this and we'll pray for you. But, their national leadership has been engaged in the nonviolent civil disobedience we've been doing. Their faith leaders from across the country have been joining all these state campaigns. Folks have been engaging and getting involved on a very regular basis with the day-to-day work and organizing, and taking the lead from those that are most impacted by these problems, by these injustices and problems. And other, organizations have come on board as well. There's about 120 or more, in fact, at this point, national organizations that have joined the campaign and have said that they want to, to be a part of this.
Well, that's encouraging to hear that, for sure. We're speaking with Liz Theoharis, co-chair with William Barber, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And Liz is also the co-director of the Cairo Center and a founder and the coordinator of the Poverty Initiative. Liz, protest and community organizing are certainly two pieces of a complex formula that leads to social change. Who else needs to be involved in this vision?
What we are doing at this stage of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is calling out to those 140 million poor people in this country, having people hear their names and hearing their conditions, so as to be able to build power in their communities amongst other folks. And so we know that what we need to do is build a movement in this country. And when we study movements throughout history, it's only when those who are most impacted by those problems, in the words of Frederick Douglass, those who would be free must strike the first blow. So it's when folks who are most affected, most impacted by the problems that are besetting our country come together and stand up and stand united. And as moral standard bearers come behind and others, we know that for a movement, we need everybody. But we're starting at this point with grassroots leaders, with folks that are impacted, with clergy, with other activists and advocates who have already woken up to the problems that are affecting us and already see that we need something, not for the short term, not for a moment, but to really build a movement.
Now, in a symbolic sense, to say the least, you're picking up where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. left off. Personally, what is that like for you?
So it's amazing work. On April 4th, Reverend Barber and myself got to stand on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel and reflect on 50 years since Dr. King's assassination. And as we reflected about 50 years from his assassination, we see that there's more poverty today than there was then. There are fewer voting rights. There's more people being pitted against each other. There's climate change that's wreaking havoc on the planet and on the people. And we have so much to do. And so that's, daunting, right? That's really big. And then to travel around this country and meet up with grassroots leaders, folks that don't have plumbing, folks that don't have health care, folks that are working jobs that pay way too little, folks that are living in encampments and being harassed by their neighbors and by the police on a very regular basis. And that those leaders are saying, our backs are against the wall and all we can do is push. All we can do is stand up and fight and organize and become, what Dr. King talked about of a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And so it is a lot of work. And it is incredibly inspiring to get to meet the real heroes and heroines of this country. The folks like Callie Greer out of Selma, Alabama, whose daughter died in her arms because Alabama wouldn't expand Medicaid. And she died of something she could have been cured from, but she didn't have the health care. Or to, be protesting and blocking at the state capitol with Claire McClinton out of Flint, Michigan, who 4 years later, there's still not clean water in Flint. And people's hair has fallen out, their kids have gotten sick, and people have been exposed to Legionnaire's disease and all kinds of things, right? Or to stand with Mashyla Buckmaster out of Grace Harbor, Washington, a formerly homeless mom who's, organizing in the community with other homeless people and saying, everybody has the right to live, everybody has the right to housing. To get to work with leaders who have gone through so much, that have suffered so much, have lost so much, and who are standing up and standing tall and saying, this is not the country we want to live in, and we're going to make it better for everybody.
Wow, it's inspiring. For anyone listening who wants to be involved, what can you tell them?
We need everyone. There is a movement that I think is rising up in states across this country, a movement that has the potential to really change things for so many people. And so what we're doing is on Mondays doing direct actions, nonviolent civil disobedience in states across the country. We're getting ready for a massive mobilization in Washington, D.C. on June 23rd, and we need everybody to come to D.C., not for ending rally and march where people go home and say, we did that, we stood against poverty, we stood against racism, but a massive mobilization where people come and get marching orders about how we're going to build a movement for the long haul. And so you can find out who's organizing in your state by going to poorpeoplescampaign.org. And you can connect up with leaders all across the country by going to that site. You can text 90975 and join the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And you can join us in Washington on June 23rd.
Fantastic. Liz Theoharis, co-chair with William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, also co-director of the Kairos Center and a founder and the coordinator of the Poverty Initiative, joining us today on America's Democrats podcast. Liz, thank you so much for your time. We do wish you the best of luck and look forward to hearing back from you again soon.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all the support.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with author Stu Eizenstat for a first-hand history of the Carter administration and why he calls him the most accomplished one-term president ever.
President Jimmy Carter, 1976 to 1980. We remember those years, and some of us do. Stu Eizenstat was in the White House with President Carter as his domestic policy advisor, out with a new book, The White House Years, President Carter. And he joins us in studio. Stu, it's good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Right. This is quite a piece of work here, right? 900 pages. You have to trim it down. Did you? Or
it was trimmed down. It is a comprehensive look based on 5,000 pages of contemporaneous notes that I took of every meeting, every phone call.
Whoa.
It's a habit I've had since law school and college. I recorded it accurately. I interviewed over 350 people, those who were pro-Carter, anti-Carter, Republicans and Democrats. And I'm very pleased that the Washington Post, the New York Times coming out Sunday, even the National Review say that it is a good reassessment of a presidency that was underappreciated, but it's also honest and candid about the mistakes he made, that I made, that others made. So it really is an insider's view based on actual notes, actual interviews, but also trying to take a historian's view of objective history, and history that's important even today.
Well, let me come back for a second, because we have known each other since those years. And when I was a young pup working for Governor Jerry Brown, I would come back to the Carter White House on some policy issues. Particularly, I remember offshore drilling. I was on part of President Carter, Secretary Cecil Andrus's offshore drilling advisory committee at the time. But whenever I came to the White House, I would meet with you as a representative of Governor Brown. Are you telling me you kept these notes of every meeting, including the meetings that we had?
That is correct.
I didn't know that.
And that is the authenticity of this book. So his failures are well known, Bill. I call it the I's. Inflation, Iran, inexperience of himself and the Georgia Mafia, inter-party warfare with Ted Kennedy. But they've overshadowed a remarkable set of accomplishments that make him, in my opinion, the most accomplished one-term president that we've ever had. Over 70% of his major legislation was passed by Congress, just under the legendary LBJs.
How much?
Almost 70% of all of his major legislation. So if you look at the energy security we enjoy today, it's largely due to our 3 energy bills, which we worked on, by the way, with Governor Brown as well. We put conservation at the center of America's consciousness. We inaugurated the solar and wind and clean energy revolution, even put a solar panel on the White House. He was the greatest environmental president that we've ever had, attacked water projects, doubled the size of our national parks with the Alaska Lands Bill. On things like offshore drilling, was very, very cautious about the environment. Ethics, he ran against Watergate and the scandals, but it was not just rhetorical, Bill. All the ethics legislation, which is more important than ever today, the disclosures going into office of assets, gift limits, restrictions on lobbying, the special counsel legislation emanated from us. The inspectors general to root out fraud, waste, and abuse emanated from us. He was a great consumer champion. He didn't appoint industry stalwarts as today to regulate their industries. He appointed pro-consumer people, even many from Ralph Nader's Raiders, and then backed it up by deregulating all the transportation modes, railroads, trucks, and most important to the average consumers, airlines. We would not have the JetBlues and the Southwests and the competition today were it not for that. And even those who love their local craft beers, we ended the regulations that had barred those coming from Prohibition days. And in foreign policy, Camp David and the Egypt Peace Treaty,
Boy, talk about something that has taken off. If there's any legacy of the Carter years, it may be this incredibly successful craft beer industry today. I mean, so many parts of the world, Portland, Oregon, Bend, Oregon, but also Washington, D.C. has a great craft beer business.
Yes, and in foreign policy, the accomplishments are even more significant. Camp David and the peace treaty with Egypt has lasted without any violation for 40 years. It's critical to Israel's security. We put human rights, Bill, at the center of our foreign policy, both applying it to right-wing dictatorships in Latin America and really giving the momentum to the democratic movements there, combining it with the Panama Canal Treaty for a whole new era in Latin relations. We did the same thing with the Soviet Union on human rights, reaching out to the dissident movement, the democratic movement headed by Andrei Sakharov, Natan Sharansky, the famous Soviet refusenik, and championing that movement. We normalized relations with China. All of these things were done, and what I've tried to do in the book is give a complete assessment, not to whitewash the problems, to deal with them candidly, but to look at the total reassessment. And in many ways, he's sort of like Harry Truman. That was his political idol. He brought in his famous slogan, "The buck stops here," on his Oval Office. Both left office very unpopular. Truman is now remembered much more for his achievements and failures.
Yeah.
And my book is an effort to look at Carter not just as a great former president, but someone who had major accomplishments in the domestic arena. And one thing else I think would be important to you and to your audience. If you saw the RBG film about Ruth Bader
Which
Ginsburg.
I haven't yet, and I have to, but I've heard...
She credits in the movie, with a picture, Jimmy Carter for his appointment over. Stephen Breyer credits Carter for his appointment on the First Circuit leading to that. But most important, Jimmy Carter, a Southern governor, appointed more women and minorities to judgeships and to senior positions than all 38 presidents before him put together. He supported affirmative action. He supported minority set-asides. He respected the law. And so, I think in many ways I'm trying to give a reassessment of a very underappreciated presidency, and that's what the New York Times review says coming out on Sunday, as the Washington Post 2 weeks ago did.
Well, the Washington Post was a very glowing review. I just got my copy last night, so I haven't had a chance to dive into it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it because, Stuart, you know better than anybody, for most people, when they hear Jimmy Carter, they think of a failed presidency, someone who came here from Georgia, didn't know Washington, came here with a bunch of rubes, if I can use that word, who didn't know Washington and were in over their heads and just got thrown out after 4 years. An unfair assessment, but you have to admit that's broadly...
That is absolutely... And that's the reason I wrote the book. Not, again, to whitewash those problems, Bill. They were very real. But to recognize that they shouldn't obscure the really huge accomplishments that he made. So where did the idea of the failure come from? It came, I think, really from two essential reasons. The first was that inflation was, in fact, roaring. But we had the same inflation problem that Nixon and Ford did. We inherited it. It got worse under our tenure because, in part, of the Iran crisis, the shutdown in oil. It doubled the price of oil. Gasoline lines, Nixon had them after the Yom Kippur OPEC embargo. We had them as well. Second was Iran, and this is really our Achilles heel. And here I'm very candid and very honest. Jimmy Carter can't be blamed, Bill, for the Shah going into exile any more than Eisenhower can be blamed for the Castro Revolution 90 miles away. But we made huge mistakes. The CIA, which had reinstalled the Shah in 1953, and 6 presidents lavished tens of billions of dollars of arms, did not know that his domestic support rested on quicksand. They did not know that for 5 years he was undergoing cancer treatment. They didn't know that. They didn't appreciate the impact that Khomeini's tapes from exile in Paris were having back at home. And then Carter made a very seminal decision. Once the hostages are taken, what do you do? Dr. Brzezinski, the National Security Council advisor, and I recommended immediate military action, not bombing, but putting mines around the harbors or blockading, as Kennedy did with the Cuban Missile Crisis, to prevent oil coming out, to show immediately that this was intolerable, that it was a breach of all international norms. Instead, the president made a humanitarian decision. I think it was the incorrect one. He met with the hostage families, and he said, my number one priority, Bill, is to get your loved ones back safely. And he did. But in the process, there were 444 days of humiliation at the hands of this radical, aging Ayatollah. And then Carter compounded the problem by holding up in the White House.
I was just going to say the Rose Garden strategy, right?
Sort of saying, okay, I'm going to spend full time on this. That only caused more press attention. The Ted Koppel show, Nightline, started that way with the hostage crisis. Cronkite.
Every night with the Ted Koppel, it was how many days, how many days.
Cronkite would end every CBS broadcast, day 103, day 305. And then, of course, the failed rescue effort, which I go into in detail. And I've even interviewed the chief of staff of Khomeini himself in my interviews. But the failed rescue effort did not occur, as many people think, because we didn't have enough helicopters. The president added more than the military required. There were 4 military services, Bill, involved. They had never practiced together. Now we have a joint command. We didn't there. And so when that helicopter, before the rescue, hit the C-130 cargo plane, 8 servicemen died. The flames in Desert One went up. so did our administration go up in flames.
Right. Now, did President, ended up being president, did Ronald Reagan play games with getting those hostages out in order to impact the outcome of the election?
Gary Sick, who was our national security advisor on Iran, contended that he did, that there was...
that he told the Iranian, hold these hostages, don't let them come out yet because that'll help Jimmy Carter.
Yes.
Keep them there until I'm
There's never been any
in.
proof of that. However, we do know that George Bush was in Paris, and that we know, and for reasons which were not clear. And we do know that there was the arms for, the Iran-Contra matter in which we ended up, through Reagan, giving arms to Iran. If we had done that, we could have gotten them out. Now, what we do know, and what is absolutely certain, and I interviewed Jim Baker and got the confirmation, he was Reagan's campaign manager, and he was also ultimately his chief of staff and then Secretary of State. That is, that in the crucial debate 8 days before the election between Carter and Reagan, they stole our debate books. They had my debate book, which I had prepared. They knew all of our attack lines. When Reagan said, there you go again, and all that's because they knew all of it. It's been proven now, and Jim Baker, in the interview, one of the 350 I did, I said, Jim, is it true? He said, it's absolutely true that our campaign manager came into me and gave it to me and said, I thought you'd like to sue that.
That's astounding.
It is astounding.
How did they steal it?
We still don't know how they did it.
These days you would say they hacked it, right? They would hack it, but this was not online, right?
We believe it came from a fellow named Paul Corbin, who was a disaffiliated Kennedy supporter, Ted Kennedy supporter. He had a contact through Pat Lucy's daughter on the White House, and we think that's how it occurred. And interestingly, the chairman of the Reagan campaign had been in the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and he's the one that gave it to Jim Baker, and Jim was really very humorous in a way. He said, I had to testify in Congress, and I knew he was going to say, no, I never gave it to Jim Baker. He said, I testified honestly that he did. I was afraid because he had been with the OSS that he would beat the lie detector test. But the fact is that Jim Baker confirmed that they had stolen that debate book. And people think, well, it was a landslide. It was. But 8 days before that debate, Bill, it was not only neck and neck, we were actually ahead. That debate was decisive.
And they stole the briefing book.
They stole our briefing book.
Wow. There are two other things that I recall that hurt the image of President Carter. One was the famous malaise speech, right? Where people said, this was such a downer, right? Where,
I'm really glad you mentioned
to lift you up, and yet he said, things are really tough, really bad.
I think one of the most exciting parts of the book...
Now, I may be reading it wrong, but I just...
No, you're not reading it wrong. One of the most exciting parts of the book is dealing with all of that, and having created the modern vice presidency with Mondale, making it a real partner. Mondale told me, after the malaise speech and the cabinet firing, that he was going to resign. I'm the only White House staff person who knew that. It's disclosed for the first time in this book. Now, what happened was Carter came back from the G7 summit in Tokyo. We were going to give an energy speech. It was already announced to deal with the gas lines. He came back. He was exhausted. He said, I've given 4 energy speeches. Nobody's listening to me. Went to Camp David, spent 10 days there, had all the experts come to try to right the ship of state. And then there was a conclusive meeting at the very cabinet room table in Camp David at which the Camp David Accords were reached. Mondale out on one side, Patrick Cadell, his 29-year-old wonderkin pollster, Ham Jordan, and others on the other. And Cadell was sort of a Rasputin-type character who had convinced Mrs. Carter and the president that the real problem the country had was a sort of malaise. It was a narcissistic society. People were only caring about themselves. And Mondale and I said, that's not the case. It's because inflation is high. It's because we've got gas lines. That's what we have to deal with. Mondale came as close to choking him as he could. But the interesting thing is Carter never used the term malaise. It was the crisis of confidence. The press used it. And the speech in the end, Bill, as I show, contrary to what I thought, was a huge success. His polls went up 17% in a day. The newsroom, the person in the mailroom who had worked since FDR's days, said to us, "I've never seen such an outpouring of support." What then happened? 2 days later, he decided to fire the entire cabinet.
Right. Yes.
And that's what got Mondale so upset, and that's what quashed all the momentum from the so-called malaise speech. So actually, it was a success.
The speech itself was a success, right?
But it was what after was a disaster.
And the other thing I think of, which I think he should get certainly more credit for, is that he asserted that human rights was a central element to United States foreign policy.
Yes, and for him, Bill...
And by the way, shouldn't it be?
It should be, because it expresses the values of our country.
Yeah.
It was for him the flip side of civil rights at home. He had grown up in a county in southwest Georgia that was 2/3 black. His playmates were all black. When he was on the Sumter County Board of Education, his first elected job, he told me in one of the interviews that he saw teenage black students in the supposed separate but equal school system having desks for 4-year-olds. So this was very emblazoned in him, and he carried that civil rights concern into foreign policy by applying it both to the right-wing dictators. We got thousands of political prisoners released. We stimulated the whole democratic movement in Latin America. You can talk about any Democrat with a small d elected president in Latin America. They will tell you it was Jimmy Carter who really activated it. And then we applied it also to the Soviet Union, to their soft underbelly. So as we were in competition with the Soviets for the hearts and minds of the Third World, applying the best American values to the Soviet Union was such a stark contrast with their repressiveness and our tolerance. Now, of course, when we talk about the current administration, Jimmy Carter appealed to the better angels. He didn't stoke grievances. Yes, he ran against Washington, but the differences between them are very stark in terms of where we are today. He respected the institutions. He respected the Justice Department and the FBI. Let me give you one example. We appointed, as part of our whole ethics legislation, we had a special counsel's office. The first target of that office, ironically, was Jimmy Carter's own chief of staff, Ham Jordan, for the false charge made by Roy Cohn, who was the hatchet man for McCarthy, and, by the way, Donald Trump's. And
Donald Trump hired him after the McCarthy years, and the two of them, I mean, that.
So he charged that Ham had smoked cocaine at Studio 54 in New York. Totally false, to get his own client off. Totally false. But because of the special counsel law and the hair trigger, Ham became the first person investigated. Did Carter blame the special counsel? Did he try to undercut the special counsel? Did he try to denigrate the special counsel?
Did he call it a witch hunt?
No. No, that's the point.
Yeah.
I mean, with his own chief of staff. So we respected the institutions. And although Carter was fiscally conservative and progressive on civil rights and poverty, he really respected the office and respected government's capacity to do things. He didn't divide us. He tried to unite us. He didn't stoke differences. He tried, again, to appeal to the better angels. So it's a stark contrast with what we have today.
The book, again, is President Carter. It's a Tom Dunn book, my publisher as well, from St. Martin's Press in New York, and it is available wherever. We'll have a link up on our website and wherever you buy books, hopefully at your local independent bookstore, or, of course, on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com, whatever. So, Stuart, you said that President Carter, which I would not contest at all, is certainly our most successful one-term president. He's probably also our most successful former president ever, isn't he?
He is, but the purpose of the book is
to talk
not
about
to dwell on that.
Right.
Yes, he certainly is. I mean, the Carter Center has been involved in the kinds of things he was doing during the presidency: human rights, democracy promotion, health care, ending several diseases like guinea worm and river blindness in Africa, monitoring elections to assure democratic elections. That's a continuation of what he was doing as president. And what I wanted to do with this book, Bill, is say everyone knows he was and is a great former president, But he also did many consequential things and many important things as president.
Right. How's President Carter today, and how active is he, and what does he think about when you reflected as you did with him on his presidency, what are his feelings about his presidency?
Well, I interviewed him 5 times among the 350 interviews. I think he feels good about the book, although he realizes that there's criticism in there. I criticize him on Iran. I criticize him on a whole host of things, not having a chief of staff initially, having too many priorities, going after too many tough issues at the same time, like the Panama Canal Treaty.
How old was he, by the way, when he became president?
He was only 50.
50. Yeah.
He was young. And this was a problem. When he retired, he was a young man.
Yeah.
And the question of what to do. So I think he's very pleased with the book, although, again, he realizes it's candid and it's honest. And if it weren't, Bill, if it was just a whitewash, it wouldn't be taken seriously. So I've tried to put in the positive and the negative, but I think you'll see that the positive sides shine through and give a whole new assessment of him. Now, how is he health-wise?
Yeah.
It's remarkable. 2.5 years ago, he announced quite dramatically that he had metastatic melanoma. It had spread to his brain. He underwent, and I saw him only a day or two before, a new therapy at Emory University called immunotherapy, which stimulates the immune system to block the spread of cancers rather than chemotherapy to kill good and bad cells. It's the future of cancer treatment. And about a third of this melanoma, it works, and it's worked for him. He is doing everything. He travels, he speaks, he fishes. He's completely engaged in all of our foreign and domestic issues. It's really quite remarkable. And now he's in his 72nd year of marriage with Rosalind, who I saw bloom from a shy campaign wife who could barely speak on the stump to an extremely accomplished first lady. She sat in on cabinet meetings. She was the only first lady, except for Eleanor Roosevelt, to testify before Congress on her own legislation, mental health, community mental health legislation. So it was beautiful to see her blossom from, again, a very shy person into a real partner.
The contrast is so stark that it's almost like they're not on the same planet. I'm talking about Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump. But if you had any reflection based on your experience and knowledge of the Carter presidency to Donald Trump and give him what word of advice or what reflection?
Sure. Well, I think a couple of things. First, he's going into a summit with North Korea. The key to Camp David was preparation, preparation, preparation.
Boy, you talk about a contrast.
Yes, but that's critical. You cannot just go in this for, a handshake. You have to understand the person you're dealing with. You have to understand the red lines of the other side and the red lines you want to achieve. You have to really understand the issues. And there's a beautiful story I tell about Camp David. He took Begin and Sadat, the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt. The first Sunday of the 13 agonizing days he was there from Camp David to the Gettysburg battlefield. To underscore the fact that they had fought 5 wars, that was enough. He went through 20 drafts that he personally did of the peace agreement over 13 days. He negotiated separately with Begin and Sadat and their aides because they were like 2 scorpions in the bottle. And then in a beautiful touch, the 13th and last day, we were close, but not quite there. And Prime Minister Begin said, Mr. President, I can't take any more. I can't make any more concessions. And he was not bluffing. His car was ready. The El Al plane was at Dulles. And President Carter saved the day and changed history by knowing enough about them, poring over CIA reports, that he loved Begin, his 8 grandchildren. He got the names of each one, autographed it personally with photographs of himself, Begin, and Sadat at Camp David, walked over to Begin's cabin at Camp David, handed them to him, saw him read each name, his lips quiver, his eyes tearing, and he said to President Carter, Mr. President, I'm putting my bags down. I'll make one last try.
Whoa.
And 40 years later, that treaty is still in effect.
Wow. What a powerful story. And just one powerful story from a great book, President Carter, The White House Years, Stu Eizenstat. Thank you so much, Stu,
Bill,
for coming in.
thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thanks for helping us all by writing this book. It's great to see you.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Brandon Rees, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.